The room was empty. Dexter Brooks stood in the doorway of what should have been his sanctuary, his hand already on the grip of his Colt single-action Army revolver, every muscle in his body coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. The bed had been slept in or made to look that way, but the man who had been sleeping in it was gone. The window was latched from the inside. The single oil lamp on the nightstand had burned down to almost nothing, its wick still faintly smoking, which meant someone had been here no more than 20 minutes ago. The floorboards near the window had been freshly scuffed, and there was a faint smell in the air that did not belong to trail dust or cheap tobacco. It was something sharper, something chemical. His blood ran cold. They had found him. After 3 weeks of riding through the Arizona territory under 3 different names, sleeping with one eye open in barns and creek beds, and once inside the rotting hull of an abandoned stage wagon, they had finally tracked down the man Dexter had been hired to protect. Marshal Elias Colt, the only living witness to the Prescott land fraud that had made Senator Hawke one of the richest and most dangerous men in the territory. And now Elias was gone. Dexter moved fast, checking the washroom, kicking open the back closet, scanning under the bed with the barrel of his revolver. Nothing. No body. No blood. No signs of struggle beyond that one scuffed patch of floor. He pressed 2 fingers to the mattress. Still warm. His mind raced through the possibilities with the cold precision of a man who had spent 15 years making his living in situations exactly this deadly. Either someone had taken Elias, which meant there would have been noise, and the thin walls of this inn would have carried it, or someone had moved him voluntarily, quietly, and with enough competence to leave almost no trace. He stormed out of the room, and down the narrow hallway toward the front of the inn, his boots striking the wooden floor hard enough to wake anyone still sleeping. It was 4 in the morning, and the Red Mesa Inn sat alone on the edge of Crestfall, a town so small it barely deserved the name, population perhaps 200 souls, and one general store that doubled as a post office. This was supposed to be the last place anyone would look. He threw open the door at the end of the hall and came face to face with Winifred Hayes. She was standing at the bottom of the stairs that led to the upper rooms, holding a tin lantern in one hand and a loaded double-barrel coach gun in the other, and she looked absolutely unsurprised to see him. She was a woman of perhaps 30, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid that had begun to come loose on one side, wearing a canvas work apron over a plain blue dress, and her hazel eyes were sharp and completely steady as she looked at him over the barrel of a gun that could remove a man's head at close range. "Your guest is safe," she said, her voice low and even. "Put the revolver down before you wake my other paying customers." Dexter did not put the revolver down. "Where is he?" "Somewhere you did not know to look," she said, "which is precisely the point." He stared at her. The lantern light played across her face, and he saw no fear in it, no hesitation, no trembling of the hand that held that coach gun with the practiced ease of someone who had held one many times before. There was something else in her expression, something that might have been impatience. "You moved him," he said. "I did." "Why?" "Because 2 men on horses arrived at my east fence line at 3:30 this morning," she said. "They were not looking for rooms. They were looking at your window." The cold in his blood turned to ice. He had checked that window before he had gone to his own room just 2 hours ago. He had been so careful. He had taken every precaution a man with his experience could take. And this woman, this innkeeper, had spotted the threat before he had. He lowered the revolver slowly. "Tell me everything," he said. And that was how Dexter Brooks, the most feared gunslinger in the Arizona territory, began to understand that the most dangerous and remarkable person in Crestfall, New Mexico territory, was the woman who ran the inn. The story of how they had arrived at that moment, however, began 3 weeks earlier and 400 miles to the east, in a town called Redemption, where a man had made a terrible mistake, and a woman had already started quietly paying for it. Redemption, Texas, in the summer of 1882, was exactly the kind of town that attracted men with dark pasts and darker futures. It sat at the crossroads of two cattle trails, which meant it had a saloon that never closed, a jail that was always full, and a graveyard that expanded faster than the church. The only establishment in Redemption that maintained any dignity was the Sunrise Hotel, a two-story frame building with whitewashed walls and clean linen, which was something of a miracle given where it sat. Winifred Hayes had inherited the Sunrise Hotel 4 years earlier when her husband, Thomas Hayes, had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1878. Thomas had been a decent man, not brilliant, not passionate, but reliable and kind, and his death at 34 had left Winifred at 26 with a hotel, a mortgage, and no family closer than a distant cousin in Missouri who had never written back to the one letter she sent. She had not collapsed. She had not sold. She had not written to the cousin in Missouri and begged for rescue. She had rolled up her sleeves and learned every trade the hotel required. She became her own bookkeeper, which was how she discovered that Thomas had been overpaying for linens by almost 30% for 2 years, because the supplier had taken advantage of his trusting nature. She renegotiated the contract herself, in writing, with a price-per-yard clause and a quality guarantee that she had drafted after spending 2 evenings reading a copy of Texas commercial law she had borrowed from the county clerk. She became her own cook when her cook quit to marry a rancher, and she learned to stretch a breakfast menu so that she could feed 15 guests on the same budget that had previously served 10. She became her own carpenter when the back porch started to rot, teaching herself from a manual and completing the repairs so well that the county surveyor who stopped for a meal complimented the workmanship and asked which craftsman she had hired. But the skill that Winifred Hayes had developed most completely, and the one that most people never knew about, was tracking. It had started as a matter of necessity. Redemption had a problem with theft. Traveling guests occasionally helped themselves to items that did not belong to them, and the local sheriff had made it clear that he had neither the time nor the interest to investigate missing silver candlesticks or a stolen horse. So Winifred had begun to investigate herself. She had started by reading the prints in the dirt around her property, comparing them, noting the gait patterns of different animals and people, learning to read compression depth and stride length. She had borrowed every book on the subject she could find, including a translated German text on forensic tracking that a German-born schoolteacher passing through had left behind in payment for his room. She had spent hours in the fields behind the hotel, practicing, testing, learning to read the ground the way a scholar read a page. Within 2 years, she was better at it than anyone in 3 counties. She could tell you how many horses had passed through her gate, in which direction, at what pace, how heavily loaded they were, and approximately how long ago they had passed. She could look at a set of boot prints and tell you whether the man wearing them was carrying a heavy saddlebag or walking free-handed, whether he was nervous and favoring one foot, whether he had paused and turned back to look at something. She could read the disturbance of gravel and grass and weathered wood like a language, and it had told her things that had kept her guests safe and her property secure in a town where the law was an idea more than a practice. It was this skill that had brought her, eventually, to Crestfall. In the spring of 1882, Redemption had grown too dangerous even for Winifred's formidable self-reliance. Senator Gerald Hawke's men had come through twice in 1 month, not looking for rooms but asking questions about guests who had stayed there, questions with a certain quality of threat underneath the polite surface. Winifred had recognized the pattern. She had seen it before, in the weeks before Thomas died, when men with that same quality of casual menace had come sniffing around the financial dealings of the town's larger landowners. Someone powerful was tightening a net, and her hotel sat in the middle of the territory they were pulling it across. She had sold the Sunrise Hotel for a fair price in April of 1882, packed what she needed into 2 trunks and a carpetbag, and made her way west to Crestfall, New Mexico territory, where a man named Abe Colton had died owing considerable money to the bank and his property, including a modest inn with 6 letting rooms, a stable, and a kitchen garden, had been put up for sale at a price she could meet. She had renamed it the Red Mesa Inn, repainted the sign herself, and been open for business by the 1st of May. It was now the 23rd of July, and she had been watching the eastern road into Crestfall with a great deal of attention for the past 3 weeks, because she had heard the name Elias Colt spoken in her common room by 2 men who should not have known it, and had exchanged a look afterward that she recognized immediately as the look of men who were employed in harm and were confirming an assignment. She had not gone to the local sheriff with this information, because the local sheriff was a man named Purvis who spent most of his days in the saloon and his nights in a manner that suggested he supplemented his official salary with unofficial payments from people who did not want him paying attention to certain things. She had instead begun watching. And then, on the 20th of July, Dexter Brooks had ridden into Crestfall. She had seen him come in from the northern trail at dusk, and she had read him the way she read everything. The horse was a good one, a dark bay gelding with powerful hindquarters and road-worn shoes that had been recently reshod, which meant he had stopped somewhere in the last 100 miles and planned for the long term. The man riding it was tall, lean in the way that came from years of hard work rather than deprivation, with a rifle in the saddle scabbard, a revolver on his right hip, and the particular kind of stillness in how he sat that she associated with men who had learned to conserve energy because they never knew when they would need it all at once. He was, she had noted with a frankness she allowed herself in the privacy of her own mind, extraordinarily handsome. There was a hard, weathered quality to his features, a jaw that looked carved, dark eyes set under a straight brow, a mouth that had clearly forgotten how to smile but seemed like it might have been good at it once. He wore a dark hat with a sweat-stained band and a long canvas duster that had seen considerable weather, and when he swung down from the horse he moved with a liquid, dangerous economy of motion that made the 2 cowhands loitering outside the general store stop their conversation and watch until he had gone inside. He had asked for 2 rooms. She had noted that specifically. One for himself, he said, and one for a companion who would be arriving later that evening. He had paid for both in cash in advance, which was not unusual. But he had paid in silver coins that were clean and unworn, not the battered mix of currency that most travelers carried, and he had specifically requested the rooms at the far end of the upper hall, away from the stairs, which most guests did not think to do unless they were thinking about it for a reason. She had given him the rooms and watched him carry his own saddlebags upstairs, without offering the observation that most innkeepers made about the stable and the supper hour, because something in his manner suggested he already knew where the stable was, and had already decided whether he would eat in the common room. He had eaten alone, in the corner table with his back to the wall, and said nothing beyond ordering his meal. He had been polite, she gave him that. His eyes had moved across the room in a pattern. She recognized methodical, systematic, cataloging exit points and potential threats, and had paused on her face for a fraction longer than they paused on anything else, though she was not sure he knew he had done it. The companion had arrived after midnight, brought in through the back. She had heard the gate and the soft footsteps and the murmur of voices, and installed in the second room without anyone seeing. She had not gone downstairs to check, because it was not her business what her paying guests did in the night, as long as nobody bled on the linen. But she had been awake. She was almost always awake late into the night, and in the following 3 days she had catalogued everything she observed with the careful precision of a woman who trusted information above all things. She knew the companion was a middle-aged man with a slight limp in his right leg, based on the prints he left when he walked the short distance from his room to the washroom at the end of the hall. She knew he was nervous, because those prints showed the particular pattern of someone who walked with extra weight on the outer edge of each foot, which meant he was leaning away from his center, the way people did when they were bracing for something to come at them. She knew that Dexter Brooks paced his room at night, back and forth, 12 feet by 12 feet, for sometimes an hour at a time, and she knew this from the faint rhythmic creak of the boards that she had memorized to the inch. She also knew, from the two men she had overheard in her common room on the evening of the 21st, that someone very powerful was paying a very serious price to find Elias Colt before he could testify before a federal land commission that was coming to Prescott at the end of August. So on the night of the 23rd, when she had gone out to check that the back gate was latched and had instead seen two horsemen on the eastern rise sitting completely still and watching the upper windows of her inn, she had not gone to knock on Dexter Brooks's door. She had made a decision. She had gone to Elias Colt's room instead. She had knocked quietly 3 times, and when the shuffling behind the door stopped and the terrified silence started, she had spoken in a low, clear voice. "My name is Winifred Hayes," she had said through the door. "I own this inn. I know who you are and I know why you are here, and there are 2 men on horses watching your window right now. Your guardian is in the room at the other end of the hall, and if I go wake him, the noise might carry. I am going to move you to a safe place right now, quietly, and I will wake your guardian after. You can trust me, or you can stay in this room and take your chances. You have about 30 seconds to decide." There had been a pause of perhaps 10 seconds, and then the latch had moved. She had liked Elias Colt for that. He was a frightened man, clearly, with the wide, hunted eyes and the shaking hands of someone who had been living under mortal threat for long enough to develop a permanent tremor. But he had made a fast decision based on incomplete information, and had chosen the option that required trusting a stranger, which took a kind of courage that was underrated. She had moved him through the back hall, down the service stairs to the kitchen, out through the root cellar door, and along the narrow path beside the stable to the hay barn, where she had positioned him in a space she had prepared 4 years ago in Redemption and reconstructed here a week after she had overheard those 2 men talking. It was a chamber dug into the foundation of the barn and covered by a hinged section of flooring fitted with a latch that could be thrown from the inside, lined with a wool blanket and provisioned with a water skin and a small lantern already lit. She had prepared it because she was Winifred Hayes, and Winifred Hayes prepared for things. She had gone back inside, replaced the appearance of the bed in Elias' room to suggest someone had slept in it recently, made a single deliberate smudge on the floorboard near the window to give the impression of a hasty exit that had been missed by the room's occupant, and then had taken her lantern and her coach gun from the kitchen and posted herself at the bottom of the service stairs to wait. She had been waiting approximately 6 minutes when Dexter Brooks came through the door at the end of the hall like a thunderstorm with boots. Now, standing in the narrow corridor with the coach gun resting in the crook of her arm and Dexter Brooks looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read shock and suspicion and something that might have been the beginning of respect, she waited for him to finish processing what she had just told him. "You prepared a hiding space," he said. "Yes. Before I arrived. A week before you arrived," she said. "I knew someone was coming and I knew Crestfall was likely to be used as a stop. The Northern Trail is the obvious route, and this is the only inn within 40 miles. He was quiet for a moment. The oil lamp at the end of the hall guttered in a draft from somewhere, and his shadow moved across the wall. "How did you know about Elias Colt?" he said. "2 men sat in my common room on the evening of the 21st and discussed a contract by its details without ever using a name, which is what people do when they think they are being careful," she said. "They were not careful enough. I know the shape of a conversation about a target without the target being named. I worked in Redemption for 6 years, and I heard a great many of those conversations. You know what those men were hired to do." "I know exactly what those men were hired to do," she said. "And I know who is paying for it, and I know what for, because I lived in Redemption when Gerald Hawke was building his land empire and I saw what it looked like from the ground." She watched his face change. The suspicion shifted, reorganized itself, became something more complex. "We need to move," he said. "We need to wait," she said. "If you go to the barn now and those men are still on the eastern rise, they will see the light change and know something has changed. We wait until one of two things happens. Either they approach, which they will do at first light if they are still here and have seen nothing, or they leave, which they may do if they believe the room they were watching is now empty." He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes without flinching and without the particular softness that some men expected from women and took as invitation to dismiss them. "All right," he said, and the word came out with a weight to it that suggested it did not come easily. "There is coffee in the kitchen," she said. "If you would like to tell me what your plan is, I have some modifications to suggest." She turned and walked toward the kitchen without looking back to see if he followed, because she was fairly certain he would. He did. The kitchen of the Red Mesa Inn was a large, warm room that smelled of wood smoke and dried sage, with a long work table in the center, and copper pots hanging from the ceiling beam, and a heavy cast-iron stove that Winifred kept fed through the night in summer because the bread needed to be started before dawn. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that sat on the back of the stove and set one in front of the chair across from hers without asking whether he wanted it. He sat down. She noted that he chose the chair with the best view of both the door and the window, which was the chair she always chose, which meant she took the one with the second best view and positioned herself so that she could watch the door at an angle. "Tell me your plan," she said. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, and for a moment she saw something under the hard exterior, a flicker of exhaustion, the kind that went deeper than sleep deprivation, the kind that settled into a man's bones after years of living at the sharp edge of danger. "We had a relay," he said. 3 stops between here and Prescott. After Crestfall, a ranch outside Magdalena, then a mission near Albuquerque, then a federal office in Santa Fe where Elias hands himself to the U.S. Marshal and goes to Prescott with an escort. He paused. The relay was known to 3 people: me, the deputy marshal in Abilene who arranged it, and the Prescott Land Commission chairman. "How long ago was that plan made?" she asked. 5 weeks. She nodded slowly. "Then you have a betrayal somewhere in those 3 people, or someone with access to one of them. 5 weeks is enough time for information to travel to Hawke's people and for them to have men positioned." She took a drink of coffee. "The relay route is compromised." "That was my conclusion," he said. "Then you need a new route that was never part of the relay," she said. "And you need to move Elias in a way that no one watching for a gunslinger protecting a witness would expect." He looked at her across the table. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," she said, "that the most dangerous thing you can do right now is exactly what everyone expects you to do. A man of your particular profile." She let that land without elaboration. "Traveling with a companion, 2 horses, weapons visible, making stops at prearranged locations, is the exact picture those men on the eastern rise have been drawn to find." She set her cup down. "Nobody is looking for a supply wagon driven by a woman with a man riding alongside as a hired hand, and a second man tucked under the goods." Dexter Brooks was quiet for 5 full seconds. "I have a freight contract that runs from Crestfall to Albuquerque," she said. "I do it quarterly. The next one is not scheduled until September, but the supplier does not care when I come as long as I take the load." She watched his face. "I can send word at first light and have the wagon loaded by mid-morning. We can be out of Crestfall before noon, on the Santa Fe Trail, moving in plain sight, which is the safest possible place to be when the people looking for you are expecting you to hide." "You would do that," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am doing it," she said. "Why?" She considered the question seriously because she respected it. It was a fair question and it deserved a genuine answer. "Because I know what Gerald Hawke does to people who get in his way," she said. "And I know what happens to every rancher and farmer and regular person in a territory when a man like that controls the land law. I have seen it. I lived inside it for years in Redemption." and I am not interested in living inside it again." She paused. "And because Elias Colt is a frightened man who made the right decision when it mattered, and that is worth protecting." Dexter looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense that he was doing the same thing she did when she was deciding whether to trust something, measuring it against everything else he knew, looking for the place where it did not line up. Whatever he found, or did not find, seemed to satisfy him. "All right," he said again, and this time it came with something different attached to it, something that might have been relief. They sat in the kitchen through the remaining hours of the night, and she told him what she knew about the men on the eastern rise and what she had read from their horses' prints when she had gone out earlier in the week, and found the same two men had done a slow pass around the perimeter of town. Probably on a reconnaissance they had not bothered to be subtle about, because they had not expected anyone to be reading the ground that carefully. He told her, carefully, and with the precise economy of a man who weighed every word, about the mission he had been given by Deputy Marshal Clarence Holt of Abilene, and about the Prescott land fraud, which was a scheme of breathtaking scale. Senator Gerald Hawke had used forged land grant documents to claim legal title to approximately 300,000 acres of federal range land across 2 territories, displacing dozens of legitimate claims and small ranching families, corrupting 2 county judges and 4 land office clerks, and enriching himself by an amount that made Winifred's jaw tighten when she heard it. Elias Colt had worked in the Prescott land office for 11 years. He had signed some of the forged documents himself. Under duress, Hawke's men had made certain threats regarding Elias' daughter, a woman of 23 who lived in Tucson, and had spent the past 18 months living with the guilt of it, watching families lose their land, watching neighbors' homes burn when they refused to vacate. He had finally written a letter to a federal judge in Santa Fe, offering everything he knew in exchange for immunity and protection, and the judge had sent word to Deputy Marshal Holt, and Holt had come to Dexter Brooks because Dexter Brooks was the best there was at this particular kind of work, and because Holt trusted him, which was a distinction that Dexter had earned over 15 years and which was not extended lightly. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "The protection work." "About 7 years," he said. "Before that I was a range detective for 2 outfits, and before that I rode for the Army." He paused, scouting. "You're from Texas," she said. He looked at her. "How?" "The way you said range detective," she said. "There is a particular flatness to certain vowels in East Texas that you carry even when you are being careful about it. Also your spurs are Texas pattern and your saddle is a Texas tree." He stared at her for a moment with an expression that was entirely new on his face, something between startlement and amusement, like a man who had just found something in a place he had not thought to look. "Lubbock," he said. "Originally." "A long time ago," she said. "A long time ago," he agreed. When the sky began to lighten, she went out the back door while he watched from the kitchen window. She circled wide around the stable, moving low and quiet along the fence line until she had a clear angle on the eastern rise, and she lay flat in the summer grass for 7 minutes until she was certain. The rise was empty. The horsemen had gone. She came back inside and told him, and she saw the tension in his shoulders ease by a fraction, not disappear, because she suspected it never fully disappeared for him, but reduced to a level that allowed forward thinking. "I'll need to tell Elias," he said. "After breakfast," she said. "Let me send word to my supplier first, and eat something. You look like you have not eaten a real meal since Abilene." He opened his mouth as if he were going to say something about not being managed, and then he looked at the kitchen and the stove and evidently thought better of it. "I can make eggs," she said, "and there is bread from last night." She made eggs and there was bread from last night, and while they ate she noted with a private, careful attention that she did not let show in her face that the exhaustion in him was older than this mission, that it had been collecting for a long time, and that there was something in the way he sat in her kitchen eating real food that had a quality of, she searched for the right word, hunger, that had nothing to do with the eggs. She recognized it because she had felt it herself in the years after Thomas died, when the loneliness of running everything alone had been so constant that she had stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing a wound once it became the new normal. She did not dwell on this observation. She had work to do. By 8 in the morning, she had sent a message to her supplier in the nearby settlement of Mesa Crossing via a reliable young man named Pedro, who sometimes helped with the stable, and who could ride faster than almost anyone she knew. The message said she was moving her quarterly freight run early and would come by mid-morning for the goods. Her supplier, a man named Briggs who sold dry goods and hardware to settlements across the territory, would have her load ready. He always did. He was a practical man who valued her punctuality and the fact that she never short-counted his goods. She explained the plan to Elias in the hay barn, with Dexter standing beside her, and she watched Elias' face as she spoke. He was a thin man of perhaps 55, with gray at his temples and the particular look of someone who had been frightened for long enough that the fear had become a structural feature of his expression. But when she outlined the plan, he did something she had not expected. He laughed, a brief, incredulous sound that contained genuine admiration. "A supply wagon," he said. "That is, yes, that is exactly. No one will look twice at a supply wagon." "They will if it doesn't move like one," she said. "So when we are on the road, you are a hired man helping with the freight. If anyone asks, your name is George, you are from Deming, and you have been working for me for 3 months. "Yes," he said immediately. She looked at Dexter. He was watching her with that expression again, the one from the kitchen, that quality of concentrated attention that was not quite like the way most men looked at her. Most men who looked at her that way were looking at the surface. Dexter Brooks was looking at something underneath it. She looked away first, which was unusual for her. The preparation of the wagon took the rest of the morning. She drove to Mesa Crossing herself with Pedro riding alongside, loaded the wagon with Briggs's goods, 2 cases of canned goods, a crate of dry beans, hardware for a mill that had ordered through Briggs, and several bolts of canvas, and drove back to the inn. She covered the bed of the wagon with a canvas drop cloth, creating a space beneath the goods where a man could lie still and be invisible, and she rigged the drop cloth with small ventilation gaps on the shaded side that would not be visible from the road. Dexter watched her do all of this from the shade of the stable doorway, and at one point he came out and reached to adjust the canvas where she was having difficulty with the corner knot. And for a brief moment, their hands were on the same section of rope, and the warmth of his hand was very close to hers, and she stepped back with a deliberateness that she hoped did not look like what it was. "That's a good configuration," he said, looking at the wagon. "Thank you," she said, and went to check on the horses. They left Crestfall at 11 in the morning. Elias was in the concealed space beneath the goods, settled on a bedroll with a water skin and a clear understanding of the ventilation arrangement. Dexter rode alongside the wagon on his bay gelding, wearing his duster and his hat at the angle of a man hired to ride freight guard, which was not uncommon. Winifred drove the wagon. She had driven this road before. She knew the places where it would be watched if it were going to be watched, the rises and the rock formations that a careful man would use, and she moved her eyes across those positions the way she moved them across everything, with the methodical patience of someone who knew how to look without appearing to look. The first hour passed without incident. The road was dry and the sky was cloudless and the horses moved well, and Winifred kept the pace steady, not slow enough to suggest caution, not fast enough to suggest urgency, just the pace of a woman who had a delivery to make and was neither in a hurry nor dawdling. Dexter rode up alongside the driver's bench at one point, close enough to speak quietly. "Rock formation at 2 o'clock, he said. "Quarter mile." "I see it," she said without looking at it. "One rider. He has been stationary for about 12 minutes based on the dust pattern from when he stopped. He is watching the road, not the rocks on our side, which means he is either looking for something specific or guarding a position." She kept her eyes forward. "He is not one of the 2 from last night." "Different horse. The one from last night had a lighter gray coloring. This one is dark. This is probably a secondary watcher positioned along the trail. Dexter was silent for a moment. You got all that from a glance. I got all that from looking at the road for the last 40 minutes, she said. He's going to see us. He is already seeing us, she said, which is fine. He is looking for a man traveling with a witness, not a freight wagon driven by a woman. We look exactly like what we are, a woman making a quarterly supply run. She paused. Don't touch your revolver. She felt him go very still beside her, and she knew without looking that his instinct had been exactly that, to reach for the weapon, and that he was overriding it because she had told him to. That cost him something, she recognized. A man of his particular kind of competence did not relinquish control easily. The fact that he did it said something about him. The wagon rolled past the rock formation at the appropriate distance. She kept the team moving at the same steady pace, kept her posture the same, kept her hands on the reins with the easy authority of a woman who drove wagons regularly. From the corner of her vision, she saw the silhouette on the rock stay still, watch them pass, and then shift position slightly, not toward them but sideways, scanning further down the road, looking for something that did not match what he saw. They did not match what he was looking for. The wagon rolled on. After another half-mile, Dexter exhaled slowly. She heard it even over the sound of the wheels. You could have done this for a living, he said. I do it for a living, she said. The tracking is what I do for free. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she had not expected from a man who wore his self-sufficiency the way he wore his coat. I am glad you were there last night, he said. I should have moved him at 2 in the morning, and I did not because I thought I had checked everything. I had not checked everything. She did not minimize it because that was not what he needed. You checked what you knew to check, she said. You could not have known I had been reading the perimeter for 2 weeks. She paused. Neither of us could have done this alone as well as we are doing it together. She felt his eyes on her profile and kept her gaze on the road. No, he said quietly. Neither of us. They stopped at midday beside a creek that she knew from her previous supply runs, where the horses could drink and the heat was broken by the shade of cottonwood trees. She climbed down from the wagon and checked on Elias, who was cramped and uncomfortable but unharmed and remarkably composed given the circumstances. And she gave him water and a piece of dried beef from her saddlebag, and told him they were making good time. While the horses drank, she walked the perimeter of the creek stop, reading the ground. Dexter came up beside her after a moment, watching what she did. Show me what you're seeing, he said. It was not a demand. It was a genuine request from a man who was watching something he had not seen before and wanted to understand it, and she found it disarming was the word, which was not a word she had expected to associate with a man who wore 2 guns and looked like the physical embodiment of frontier danger. She crouched down at the edge of the creek bank and traced the edge of a set of prints with her finger without touching them. 3 people stopped here this morning, she said. 2 heavy men and 1 lighter, probably a woman or a younger person. They stopped for about 15 minutes, the horses drank, and they left on the northern trail. She moved a few feet along the bank. Before that, yesterday afternoon, a single rider came and went quickly, spent less than 5 minutes. The horse never actually drank, just circled. He was checking the stop. Dexter crouched beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the shade of the cottonwoods, and she kept her attention focused entirely on the ground because it was where it belonged. How do you know the horse didn't drink? He asked. The prints at the water's edge are all old. They are partially eroded by this morning's flow, she said. Any prints from yesterday afternoon would show the same erosion. But the pattern here, she indicated a section slightly back from the water's edge, shows a horse that was kept in place, moving its weight side to side, and then pivoted and left. It never went forward to the water. He was looking at the ground with the focused concentration of a man trying to see what she saw. She watched his face as he worked at it, and there was a quality in his expression that she had to look away from because it did something to her composure. You learned all this yourself, he said. "From books and practice," she said, "and necessity. I have worked with Army scouts," he said. "Apache scouts, good ones, men who do this their whole lives." He paused. "You are as good as them." She stood up and dusted her hands on her apron. "The Apache scouts have a tradition and a community of knowledge," she said. "I had a German textbook and a lot of free time after midnight." She allowed herself a small, dry smile. Different starting point, same general destination. He stood up too, and for a moment they were standing close together in the shade of the cottonwoods, with the sound of the creek and the horses and the silence of the wide, empty country around them. And he looked at her with an expression that she recognized, because she had been seeing it build over the past 12 hours and had been deliberately not naming it. "Winifred," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it carefully, like he was being precise about something that mattered, made her breath catch in a way she had not felt in a very long time. "We should get back on the road," she said. "We should," he agreed, and neither of them moved for precisely 2 seconds, and then she turned and walked toward the wagon. The afternoon road unrolled before them in the summer heat, and they talked. Not about the mission or the threat or Hawke's men, but about other things. The country they were passing through, which she knew better than he did, and Texas, which he knew better than she did, and what she had done in redemption, and what he had done in the years between Lubbock and the present, which was a long road with a great many stops on it, not all of them good. He told her about the Army years with the careful editing of a man who had decided to tell the truth, but was still deciding how much truth, and she respected the editing because she understood it. He had scouted for campaigns against the Comanche in the early 1870s, and when she asked him what he thought of that now his face did something complicated. "I was 23 and I thought the Army meant order and order meant justice," he said. "I was wrong about several things." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 2 years after I left trying to undo what I had done, a small piece at a time, which is not enough, but it is what a person can do." She thought about this. "The injustice in this territory runs very deep," she said. "The land fraud is not only about wealthy senators. It is about Apache and Navajo families who had what little they were left taken again through false documentation. 3 of the claims I tracked in redemption overlapped with reservation borders that had been moved on paper without consent." She paused. "Elias knows that too, I think. I believe part of why he finally wrote to the judge is that he realized the scale of who was being harmed." Dexter nodded. There was something in his expression that was heavier than agreement, something that had the quality of an old debt being acknowledged. "You see a lot," he said. "I pay attention," she said, "which is different." The second watcher station she had expected, a fork in the road near a dry wash about 20 miles east of Magdalena, was empty when they reached it. She told him this, and he processed it with a tactical mind she had come to appreciate over the course of the afternoon. The absence of a watcher was information too, and what it likely meant was either that the watch had been pulled for consolidation elsewhere, or that Hawke's men were confident enough in their intelligence about the relay route that they were waiting at the prearranged stops rather than watching the open road. "They are probably at the Magdalena Ranch right now," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then we do not go near the Magdalena Ranch." "No," he said. "I know a route through the hills west of the town," she said. "It adds half a day, but it avoids the main valley road entirely." He looked at the sky, calculating light and time. "We would need to camp." "I brought supplies for that possibility," she said. He looked at her. She met his look with the calm directness she applied to everything. After a moment, one corner of his mouth turned up in a way that was not quite a smile, but was clearly trying to become one, and it did something entirely unreasonable to her pulse. "Of course you did," he said. They made camp that night in the shelter of a rock escarpment she had camped at before on her freight run, far enough off the main road that their fire would not be visible, close enough to water that the horses were settled. Elias came out from under the wagon and ate a real meal for the first time in what he said had been several days. She had brought salt pork and dried beans and cornmeal, and she cooked over the small fire with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding people professionally for years. After they ate, Elias fell asleep almost immediately, rolled in his blanket beside the wagon wheel with the deep unconsciousness of a man whose body had finally accepted that it was temporarily safe. His soft snoring was oddly comforting in the dark. She and Dexter sat on opposite sides of the fire and were quiet for a while, and it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that did not need to be filled, which was something she had not experienced in a very long time. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "You can ask," she said. "Why are you still alone?" He paused. "That came out wrong. What I mean is, a woman like you, with what you know and what you can do, I would have expected that men would be lining up." She smiled despite herself. "Men do not generally like discovering that a woman knows more about their capabilities than they do," she said. "I was told once, very sincerely, that I made a man feel unnecessary, and that he could not love something that made him feel unnecessary. What did you say to that?" "I said that if his sense of his own value depended on my ignorance, that was his problem rather than mine," she said. "He took that poorly." Dexter laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was unexpectedly good, not a polished sound but a real one, surprised out of him with a warmth underneath it. "Good answer," he said. "He left the hotel within the hour," she said, "which I considered the best possible outcome of the conversation." He shook his head slowly, still with that almost smile. "Thomas Hayes," he said. Did he appreciate what he had?" The question was personal enough that she should probably have deflected it, but the firelight and the quiet and the way he had asked it with a genuine care she had not anticipated made her answer honestly. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "He was kind to me and he was honest and he never tried to diminish me. But he did not understand me." She looked at the fire. "He knew I was capable, but I do not think he understood the extent of it, or perhaps he chose not to examine it too closely. It was a comfortable marriage. I was fond of him." She paused. "But I do not think I ever felt truly seen." The fire crackled. The night was warm and very still. "I understand that," Dexter said, and his voice had a quality that she recognized from her own when she spoke about it. The cadence of someone who had carried something alone for a long time. "You were married?" she asked. "Close to it," he said. "Twice." He was quiet. "The first time was in Texas, before the army. She married someone else while I was away, which was her right, and I do not blame her for it. The second time was after the army, a woman in Abilene who was wonderful and patient, and deserved far better than a man who spent 3 weeks out of every 4 on somebody else's emergency." He looked at the fire. "She told me she loved me, but she could not love what my life required. And I could not change what my life required, not then, and so that was the end of that. Could you change it now?" She asked, and then immediately wanted to take the question back because it was too much, too direct, too close to the edge of something she was not sure she was ready to be standing near. He looked at her across the fire, and his dark eyes had a quality that she recognized as the moment before a decision. "I think that depends," he said carefully, "on what I would be changing it for." The pause between those words and whatever came next was filled by a coyote calling somewhere in the dark hills, a long, lonesome sound that the rock walls threw back in echo, and the spell of the moment did not break so much as transform into something that was also present but less immediately overwhelming, and she picked up her cup and looked at the fire and let the practical world reassert itself. "We should sleep," she said. "The route through the hills is rougher than the valley road, and I want to start before full daylight." "Yes," he said. He did not say anything more, but when she looked at him briefly before she turned toward the wagon, his expression was not the carefully controlled neutral she had seen for the first 24 hours. It was something more open, more honest, and considerably harder to look at without something in her chest responding to it. She did not sleep for some time. They made the western detour through the hills the next day, a harder road that required her full concentration at the reins, and took them through country that was dramatic and remote and entirely empty of anyone who might be watching. Elias walked for part of the afternoon to spare the horses on the steeper grades, and Dexter rode ahead on the bay to check the path. And she drove the wagon through the switchbacks with the same focused competence she brought to everything, and tried not to watch the way Dexter sat a horse with such absolute effortless authority. The second night they camped at the base of the hills where the terrain opened back toward the Santa Fe road. And this time, they sat by the fire not as strangers or as a professional partnership, but as two people who had been through something together and come out the other side with a changed understanding of each other. He told her about Lubbock, about his father who had been a blacksmith and his mother who had died when he was 12, and the way the flat, endless country of the Llano Estacado had shaped the inside of him before he had known it was being shaped. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and the very particular kind of education she had received from a father who believed that a curious mind required a thorough library, and did not see why that should be any different for a daughter than a son. "He is why I read the tracking books," she said. "He was the one who told me that any skill worth having can be learned from the right sources, and any knowledge worth wanting can be found if you are willing to look for it. I believed him, and I still believe him." "He sounds like a remarkable man," Dexter said. "He was," she said. "He died 3 years ago. He never came west. I am sorry he did not." Would he have liked it? Dexter asked. She thought about it. He would have found it fascinating and alarming in equal measure, she said. He would have had a great deal to say about the law and the lack of it, and he would have appreciated the sky. She looked up at the enormous vault of stars above the rock hills. He had a lot to say about the sky. Dexter followed her gaze upward. They sat like that for a while, looking at the stars, and the fire burned down slowly, and the night pressed warm and enormous around them. "Winifred," he said. "Dexter," she said, and that somehow was enough for right now. On the morning of the third day, they rejoined the Santa Fe road 20 miles above where they had left it, well clear of the Magdalena area, and the road was ordinary and unremarkable, and she felt the shift in both of them. The return of vigilance, of professional attention, as the civilized world came back with its comforts and its dangers. She did not let the vigilance relax her own, though. She watched the road as carefully as ever, and at a stage stop 12 miles north of the Santa Fe Junction, she read something that made her draw the wagon over immediately. "What is it?" Dexter was beside her in seconds. "Tracks from this morning," she said. "4 horses, heavy, moving fast on the outbound road. They came from the direction of Santa Fe." She pointed. 2 of them circled this stop twice before leaving. They were not stopping for the stage. They were checking if anyone had been here. She looked ahead down the road. They went north toward Albuquerque. "The mission stop," he said. "They know the relay route," she said. "They are hitting all of them." She looked at him. "The federal office in Santa Fe is the last stop before Prescott. If they have men at every point along the relay, then the Santa Fe office itself may be compromised," he said, and his face was taut with the urgency of it. "We need to get Elias directly to a federal marshal and not to a specific location that someone else arranged," she said. "Is there anyone in Santa Fe you trust personally, not through the relay?" He thought for a moment, and she watched the thinking happen, the fast, methodical movement of a trained mind through its options. "There is a man named Augusto Reyes," he said. "He is a federal land surveyor attached to the New Mexico Territorial Office. He is honest. I know this because I worked with him on a survey dispute 3 years ago in Colorado, and he refused a bribe from a man who could have made his life very difficult. He is not in the relay. He does not know about Elias at all. Do you know where he offices?" "Palace of the Governors, Santa Fe," he said. "Territorial Land Office." "Then that is where we go," she said. "And we go directly, not to the federal marshal's office." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something shift behind his eyes, the last of the professional reserve, the part that said a man in his position made the final calls on his own, giving way to something that recognized what it was looking at. "Yes," he said simply, "that is where we go." They drove into Santa Fe on the morning of the fourth day, tired and road dusty and carrying a secret that had grown heavier with every mile. Santa Fe was a real city, by the standards of the territory, with its old Spanish architecture and its bustling plaza, and the palace of the governor stretching along the north side of it. And Winifred drove the wagon through the streets with the same steady composure that had carried her 400 miles from Crestfall, and said nothing, except to ask a passing man for the location of the territorial land office. Augusto Reyes was a compact, precise man of Mexican descent in his mid-40s, with a surveyor's careful eyes and the particular kind of uprightness that came not from self-importance but from a genuine belief in the value of what he did. He recognized Dexter immediately, and his face cycled through surprise and urgency, and a particular kind of sharp intelligence that read the situation very quickly. Dexter made the introduction in 2 sentences. Reyes listened. Then he stood up, closed his office door, and said, "Tell me everything." It took 40 minutes, and Winifred contributed her part: the overheard conversation in Redemption, the men on the Eastern Rise, the compromised relay route, the tracks she had read at the stage stop. Reyes took notes in a small, precise hand and asked questions that confirmed his understanding of the gravity of what he was hearing. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a federal circuit judge named Harrington who is currently in Santa Fe for a land hearing. He is not connected to the Prescott Commission, but he has full federal authority. If Elias Colt gives his statement here, in this office with Judge Harrington present, it creates an official record that cannot be suppressed by anything happening in Prescott." He paused. The Prescott Commission hearing would become a formality. The statement would already be part of the federal record. "Can you arrange that today?" Dexter asked. "I can have the judge here within 2 hours, Reyes said. "He trusts me, and I believe he will find this situation worth 2 hours of his schedule." He looked at Elias Colt directly, not at Dexter or Winifred, but at the frightened, worn man who had made the right choice eventually, and paid a terrible price for it on the way. "You are safe in this building," he said. "I give you my word." Elias Colt looked at Reyes and then looked at Winifred, and his eyes were wet. "Thank you," he said, and it was aimed at her specifically with a directness that made her chest tighten with something that was not quite sadness and not quite pride but lived in the country between them. "Thank yourself," she said. "You wrote the letter." Judge Harrington arrived within 90 minutes, a formidable man of 60, with the no-nonsense quality of someone who had spent decades in frontier law and was deeply unimpressed by power, unless it was backed by evidence. The evidence that Elias provided over the following 3 hours was extraordinary. Names, dates, document numbers, specific transactions, specific threats, specific payments to specific officials. Harrington wrote it all into the official record with a steady hand and a face that grew progressively more grim and more determined. Dexter stood watch outside the office through all of it. Winifred sat in the hall on a wooden bench and let herself be still for the first time in 4 days. And the tiredness came over her, in a wave that she had been holding back through sheer force of will for 72 hours. She was nearly asleep when she felt the bench shift beside her and looked up to find Dexter sitting down, close enough that his shoulder was warm against hers. "It's done," he said quietly. "Harrington is sending it by telegraph to the federal district office in Denver tonight. He said it is enough to bring federal charges regardless of what happens in Prescott." She exhaled slowly. "Good. Elias will be taken to a safe location by Reyes's people until the formal proceedings. He is out of danger." He paused. "It is over," she nodded. The tiredness was very deep now, and she felt the days of tension releasing from her body in layers like ice thawing. She was aware of his shoulder against hers and did not move away from it. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Report back to Deputy Marshal Holt," he said. "File my account. Find out who in the relay talked, which Holt will need to know." He paused, and then he stopped. "And then," she said, "I have been on the road for 15 years, he said. "On somebody else's emergency for 15 years. He turned his head toward her and she turned hers, and they were very close in the half-light of the corridor. "I have been thinking about what I said by the fire, about what it would take to change what my life requires." "You have been thinking about that for 3 days while also watching A Road for Killers," she said. "It turns out you can do both," he said, and the almost smile was fully a smile now, genuine and warm and entirely unlike the face he had been wearing when he rode into Crestfall. Her heart was doing something entirely undignified, and she had never been the kind of woman who apologized for what she felt, so she let it do what it was doing and held his gaze and said, "And what did you conclude?" "I concluded," he said carefully, "that there is a woman who runs an inn in Crestfall, New Mexico territory, who is the most remarkable person I have met in 15 years of meeting remarkable people, and that I have an interest in knowing whether she would be agreeable to me coming back to Crestfall when my business in Abilene is finished." She looked at him for a long moment. "To stay," she said. "To start," he said, "and see what happens after that." She thought about the empty inn in Crestfall, and the root cellar she had prepared, and the way he had sat in her kitchen in the small hours of the morning drinking coffee, with the exhaustion of a man who had been moving too long without a reason to stop, and the way her hands had felt on the same rope as his hands. "The Red Mesa Inn," she said, "has a vacancy." He laughed, that surprised, genuine sound, and it echoed in the federal corridor, and a clerk down the hall looked up from his papers and quickly looked back down, and Winifred felt something open in her chest that had been carefully latched shut for years. He went to Abilene. He spent 3 weeks there, filing his report, spending long hours with Deputy Marshal Holt sorting through the relay betrayal. It had been the deputy marshal's own clerk, a young man named Fowler who had been in debt to a Hawke associate, and had sold what he knew for a sum that would do him no good now that Harrington's federal record was already filed and Hawke's legal defenses were collapsing. Senator Hawke himself was arrested in Prescott on the 6th of August, before the Land Commission even convened, on the strength of the statement Elias Colt had made in Santa Fe. The news traveled fast. Dexter wrote to Winifred twice during those 3 weeks. His letters were careful at first, then less careful, with the gradual loosening of a man who had spent a long time keeping himself armored and was finding the armor less necessary than it used to be. He wrote about Abilene and the legal proceedings, and about a book he had found in a general store there, a natural history of the Sonoran Desert that he thought she would like, which he sent along with the second letter in its own wrapping. She wrote back. Her letters were more fluent than his to start with, because she had always been better with words on a page than most people, but has improved rapidly, and the letter she received in the 3rd week made her read it twice and then sit down at the kitchen table and feel something very large and very quiet settle inside her. He had written, "I find that I am not very interested in anything in Abilene except finishing the business that brought me here. I find that Crestfall is on my mind with a frequency that is not professionally relevant. I find that a woman who can read the ground like a scholar reading a page and who prepares for contingencies a week in advance has become the standard by which I measure every other thought I have about the future. I do not know if this is too much to say in a letter. I am saying it anyway." She wrote back, "It is not too much. Come home." She had written the words before she realized what word she had used, and then she read it back and decided she had meant it. He arrived in Crestfall on the 28th of August, on the same dark bay gelding with the road-worn shoes, at the same dusk hour, and she was in the kitchen garden when she heard the gate, and she came around the side of the building and saw him swing down from the horse with that same liquid, dangerous economy of motion. And the way he looked when he saw her standing in the garden with dirt on her hands, and her hair coming out of its braid, was the most honest expression she had ever seen on a human face. He walked toward her and she met him halfway, because she was not the kind of woman who waited, and when he stood close enough to speak quietly he said, "I brought you a book." "I know," she said. "You mentioned it in the letter, the Desert Natural History." "And something else," he said, and held out his other hand, in which was a small piece of carved bone on a strip of leather, a stylized eye, the kind she had seen on Apache-made carvings. "From a man in the trading post in Las Cruces. He said it was for seeing what others cannot see." He paused. "I thought it was appropriate." She took it from his hand, and her fingers closed around his for a moment before she took it away, and he stood very still. "Are you going to kiss me or stand there being poetic about a carved bone?" she asked. He kissed her, right there in the kitchen garden with the last of the August light going gold around them. And it was thorough was the word, thorough and unambiguous, and with a warmth behind it that she had felt building for 400 miles of desert road, and finally let herself simply feel. The autumn came to Crestfall and brought the smell of wood smoke and the first cold rains, and Dexter Brooks did not leave. He took a room, the one at the end of the hall, the one he had originally requested, and did not sleep in it much, which was a fact known to nobody except the two of them and Pedro, who was 17 and entirely unbothered by adult arrangements, and who helped with the stable with the same reliable cheerfulness regardless of anything. Dexter did not become an innkeeper, because that was not what he was, but he found things to do that mattered. He rode the perimeter of Crestfall regularly and knew within a week who the honest people were, and who the less honest ones were. And he had a conversation with Sheriff Purvis that Winifred was not present for, but that resulted in Purvis resigning the following month, and the town council asking Dexter if he would take the temporary position while they arranged a proper election. He said he would consider it if the position came with genuine authority to enforce federal land law, which was a condition that had not previously been attached to the job, and which the town council agreed to with the alacrity of people who had been waiting for someone to say it. He was, in the end, a man who had spent 15 years keeping order in other people's jurisdictions. Having a jurisdiction of his own suited him. He proposed to her on a cold November evening in the kitchen, where they sat most evenings now after the guests were settled, drinking coffee and talking about the things that interested them, which were extensive and various and never ran out. He did it simply, without preamble, with the directness that she had come to value above almost anything else in him. He said, "I want to marry you. Not because I need anything from you. You don't need anything from me either, and that has never been truer of any two people. But because when I am here, in this kitchen, with you, I am the person I wanted to be when I was 20 years old before the world made me into something more defended, and I don't want to be anywhere else." She set down her coffee cup. She considered the proposal with the full weight of her intelligence, which was considerable, and she considered him across the table, this man who had sat in her kitchen at 4 in the morning learning about the scope of what he had not noticed, and had responded by being genuinely grateful rather than diminished, and who had spent 400 miles listening to her and adjusting the plan and trusting her instincts over his own considerable professional instincts, and she said, yes. She said it without qualifications or conditions or the careful hedging she had built around herself for years. Because the thing about Dexter Brooks was that he had not required her to be less than she was at any point, had in fact required her to be more, had seen all of it and looked at her, the way her father had always said a person deserved to be looked at, as if what was inside was the most interesting thing in the room. They were married in December of 1882 in the small church in Crestfall, which had a real minister now, because the town had grown enough in the past year to attract one, and the ceremony was attended by the town council and Pedro and his family, who were neighbors, and Augusto Reyes, who had ridden from Santa Fe specifically for it, and Elias Colt, who had sent a letter from his daughter's home in Tucson, where he was living quietly with his immunity arrangement secured and his conscience, if not entirely at peace, at least no longer breaking him. The letter from Elias said, "I would not be alive to write this if not for your wife. Please tell her that Josephine and I light a candle for her every Sunday. It is not enough, but it is what we can do." Dexter read the letter aloud to her, and she received it without the modesty that would have diminished it, and without the pride that would have made it about her. She received it as what it was, the acknowledgement of a real consequence of a real choice, and folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept important papers. The winter passed, and the spring came, and the Red Mesa Inn expanded in the spring of 1883. Because Crestfall was growing and Winifred had a plan for an additional 4 rooms and a proper dining room that would serve the town as well as the guests, which was a good business decision, and she had drafted the construction specifications herself, and hired 2 carpenters, and managed the project from start to finish with the same systematic competence she brought to everything. Dexter watched her do it and was not surprised by it and was not threatened by it, and when people in town sometimes addressed questions about the construction to him rather than to her, he redirected them to her every time without exception, which was something she had not asked him to do and which he did instinctively because it was the correct thing, and because he was, beneath everything, an honest man. He was a good sheriff. Not because he was the most fearsome man with a gun in the territory, though he was that, but because he was methodical and fair, and had a genuine belief that the law was supposed to protect the people who needed protecting, and he applied it that way. The land fraud cases that came out of the Hawke prosecution opened up a great deal of legal territory in the New Mexico territory, and there were months where Dexter was in deep correspondence with federal offices and territorial courts, and Winifred helped him with the written work because his practical legal knowledge was excellent, and his formal writing was functional, and she could make it more than functional. And they worked on it together at the kitchen table in the evenings, with the same comfortable collaborative ease they had brought to everything since the first night. In the summer of 1883, she told him she was expecting a child. He was in the kitchen when she told him, sitting at the table with a sheaf of land commission correspondence, and the way his face changed was something she had no words for and did not need to, because she watched it happen, and it was complete and sufficient in itself. The shock and the joy and the particular quality of a man discovering that the life he has been carefully rebuilding has become real in a way that cannot be undone. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and gathered her into him with a gentleness that was entirely new and entirely consistent with who he was, and she let herself be held because she wanted to be, which was not something she was accustomed to wanting, and his voice against her hair said her name in a tone that she kept in her chest afterward like something she carried when she needed it. "Are you frightened?" he said. "No," she said, and meant it. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "Absolutely terrified." She laughed and felt him laugh against her at the same time, and it was good, that shared laugh, that honest admission. Their son was born in February of 1884 in the Red Mesa Inn, in the room with the best view of the mesa that gave the inn its name. Winifred had arranged everything in advance, the midwife from Magdalena, the medical manual she had read twice and kept beside the bed, the supplies she needed, the schedule for Pedro to manage the stable during the relevant days. She was prepared, as she was for everything. The labor was long and she was strong through it, and Dexter sat outside the door through every hour of it, and when the midwife opened the door and said it was done and the child was well, he came inside and stood at the bedside and looked at his wife holding their son, a squalling, red-faced, furiously alive small person, with an expression that was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on a human being. They named him Thomas Reyes Brooks. Thomas for her first husband, because he had been a good man and she wanted to honor that. Reyes for Augusto Reyes, who had received a telegram with the news before it reached anyone else, and who had written back with a felicity of expression that had made her laugh out loud. Thomas was a vigorous, curious child, dark-eyed like his father and stubborn like his mother, and he took his first steps in the kitchen of the Red Mesa Inn at the approximate age at which such things happened, and immediately used them to pursue the cat that had taken up residence in the kitchen garden, which was a trajectory that satisfied everyone who observed it. In 1885, Senator Gerald Hawke was convicted in federal court on 16 counts of land fraud, conspiracy, and bribery, a verdict that was reported in every newspaper in the territory, and which Winifred read thoroughly and filed in her important papers box. The land that had been fraudulently claimed was not fully returned. These things were never fully returned, and she knew that, and it was a real limitation that sat alongside the genuine victory, but the federal rulings opened the way for many dispossessed families to pursue their legitimate claims, and some of them did, and some of them won. Augusto Reyes came to Crestfall in the summer of 1885 for a celebration that Winifred organized at the inn, which had by then become the social center of Crestfall in the way that good inns in good towns always did, and he brought his wife Maria and their 2 daughters, and the dinner that Winifred cooked for 10 people that evening was the best meal she had ever made, by her own private assessment, not because of the food, but because of the people at the table. Elias Colt sent a telegram from Tucson: "Justice, even imperfect, is worth the cost. Thank you both." By 1886, the Red Mesa Inn had 8 letting rooms, the dining room that served the town 3 days a week, a reputation that brought travelers specifically to Crestfall rather than through it, and a vegetable garden that Winifred had expanded to supply both the kitchen and a small market stand that Crestfall's population now justified. Dexter had served as sheriff for 4 years when the town held its first proper election in January of 1887, and he was elected with a margin that made him deeply uncomfortable because he did not like being the object of public sentiment, and Winifred found this deeply amusing and told him so. And he looked at her the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table for 5 years, with a depth of warmth and specific attention that had not diminished by a fraction since the first night they had sat together in the small hours and begun the work of trusting each other. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara, was born in April of 1887, with considerably less drama than her brother, because Winifred had by then accumulated enough experience to understand exactly what the process required and had prepared accordingly. Clara arrived in the world with the same vigorousness that Thomas had, and a tuft of auburn hair that was exactly the color of her mother's, and Dexter held her in the kitchen a few hours after her birth, with the careful enormity of a man who had never quite gotten over being trusted with something this important. Thomas, who was 3, regarded his sister with the philosophical skepticism appropriate to his age, and then decided she was acceptable and brought her his wooden horse as a gift, which she ignored but which he placed carefully beside her anyway, and this gesture was witnessed by both parents and was the kind of thing that a person carried in their heart for the rest of their life. On an evening in the September of 1887, Winifred sat on the front porch of the Red Mesa Inn as the sun went down behind the mesa and painted the sky in colors that her father had indeed, as she had predicted, would have had a great deal to say about. Thomas was inside helping Pedro with some task that involved more noise than the task required. Clara was asleep in the cool room at the back of the inn, tended by the reliable young woman named Anna who sometimes helped in the evenings. The common room was doing its quiet business of travelers settling in for the night. Dexter came out and sat in the chair beside her, his hat on his knee, his shoulder warm against hers in the cooling air, and they looked at the sky together. "Are you happy?" he said. She thought about the question with the honesty that she applied to everything. She thought about Ohio and her father and the schoolteacher's library. She thought about redemption and Thomas Hayes and the years of doing everything alone. She thought about the German textbook and the hours in the fields learning to read the ground. She thought about the night she had moved a frightened man through the back of her inn and come face to face with a gunslinger in a hallway and said, without flinching, that his guest was safe. She thought about 400 miles of desert road and campfires and a conversation about what a person would change their life for. She thought about the kitchen table and the letters and the book about the Sonoran Desert that still sat on her bedside table. She thought about a carved bone eye on a leather cord that she had worn every day since, and was wearing now, resting against her collarbone, given by a man who had understood her before he knew her, because he paid the same kind of attention to the world that she did. She thought about Thomas running across the kitchen floor in pursuit of the cat. She thought about Clara's tuft of auburn hair. She took Dexter's hand where it rested on his knee and laced her fingers through his, and felt his hand close around hers with the easy certainty of long habit and long belonging. "I am," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it in the way that still, after 5 years, did something entirely unreasonable to her pulse, and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The mesa turned red in the last of the light, and the stars came out over Crestfall one by one, and the Red Mesa Inn glowed warm from every window, and inside it the sounds of real living went on: a child's voice, the clink of a supper dish, the creak of the floorboard she had memorized to the inch, and Winifred Hayes, who had learned to read the ground like a language and had used that language to change the shape of what came after, sat in the September evening beside the man who had seen all of her and asked for more, and was, in every way that mattered, entirely home.